Mike always said he was born in the wrong era. If he'd come up in the 80s, he would have been the kid with a camcorder, trespassing in old malls and half-collapsed movie theaters, chronicling decay before YouTube made it cool. But instead, he got stuck with TikTok, a 24/7 dopamine drip, and a best friend who thought nothing was fun unless it was illegal, or at least ill-advised. Walt and Mike met the summer after high school, united by a mutual hatred of Florida's relentless sunshine and their shared love for places where sunlight struggled to reach. Their first real adventure was a derelict bowling alley where Walt almost lost a trekking shoe to a rotting-out floorboard, and Mike nearly fell through a rotting lane. They bonded over the adrenaline, the dust, and the weird sense of peace that came from sitting in the silent, forgotten places of the world. Urban exploring. Urbex, if you want to sound like you knew what you were doing. It became their thing, and by their mid-20s they developed the system. Mike did the research, scouring forums, property records, and the dark corners of Google, and Walt handled the logistics, like snacks, batteries, travels expenses, and if needed, the occasional bail money. They were sarcastic, sure, but never careless. Mike's rules: we run from security guards, we bring extra batteries, and never get out of sight from each other. It was a rainy Thursday when Mike had found it. He was hunting the musty archives of the county library, flipping through microfiche like a detective in a noir film. He started with a rumor posted on an Urbex subreddit. Something about a Cold War-era residential bunker somewhere in the woods outside of town, built for a local bigwig who vanished after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people scoffed. Urban legends were Urbex catnip. But Mike needed more. Hours in, he had found it. A half-forgotten article from 1961, buried in microfiche. Local businessman builds family shelter amid crisis, the headline blared. The article was vague, but it mentioned a property line, a shipment of concrete, and most importantly, a grainy, half-readable blueprint. People of the time were in awe of such a magnificent dwelling and envious that such a rich guy could build such a place. As Mike squinted, traced and faded contour lines, he opened up Google Maps on his smartphone and started searching. Looking through maps was his forte. He knew roughly of the location and snapped a photo with his phone. There it was, more or less. But he couldn't wait to tell Walt. That night, over grandma-style pizza and orange crush, Mike laid out the evidence. Walt was skeptical as always. "Are you sure this isn't just some doomsday prepper root cellar? I mean, the last time you got this excited, we found an empty pool full of dead animals. And that shit stank." Mike grinned. "Yeah, that was pretty gross. But I have a really good feeling about this one. Here, take a look at the pics from Google." And sure enough, the property looked abandoned, and the pictures showed some kind of structure half obscured by the woods. Walt rolled his eyes, but Mike could still see the spark. "Fine, but if this thing turns out to be a dud and we get covered in asbestos or something, I'm blaming you for a life of cancer." They both share a laugh and set a plan to meet up the next day. The following day, as they tossed gear into Walt's battered Subaru, the sky was overcast, and the weather reports were thick with the promise of rain. Mike checked the map one last time. Walt checked the batteries, and their banter filled the gaps where nerves might creep in. "Last chance to back out, Walt," Mike said. Walt smirked, slamming the trunk. "After you dragged me through 3 miles of poison ivy last month? Nah, dude, you wish." And with that, they pulled onto the empty highway, headlights cutting into the dusk, Walt's house in the rear view. The Subaru speakers were garbage, but that just meant everything sounded even better to Mike and Walt. It was perfect for the playlist Walt insisted on, and Mike also loved. Nirvana's Aero Zeppelin fuzzed in and out of existence as the boy screamed the chorus of All the Kids Will Eat It Up, Alice in Chains, Them Bones, and then Soundgarden's Limo Wreck. The dirty guitars and angsty vocals mixing with the hum of tires on wet asphalt. It was pure bliss. Mike tapped the beat on the glove box and tried not to sing along too loud, and Walt, as usual, was off-key and didn't care. "You know what would make this better?" Mike said. "If we could just teleport and skip the part where your car smells like a hot shit in the August sun." Walt shot a look at him. "You're the one who left the burrito under the seat for a month, dumbass." Mike just grinned, flicking his eyes to the rear view. "Well, at least we have food if we get desperate enough," Walt retorted. "I'd rather eat your sister's—" Okay, that's enough," Mike interrupted. The road wound through stretches of pine and tangled undergrowth, the world outside a blur of green and gray. There was something comforting about being in the car with Walt, like they were both 17 again, no cares in the world and driving nowhere just to see if they could find trouble. Between tracks, Mike broke the comfortable silence. "You remember last summer? You know, the house with the blue shutters?" Walt groaned, slumping in a seat. "Don't remind me. I still smell like skunk every time it rains. Hell, I think it's in my DNA now." Mike laughed, almost spitting out his Gatorade. "Man, I swear I've never seen you move that fast. You vaulted that basement window like you were in the Olympics." "Yeah, well, you didn't see that thing's face. I'm convinced it was possessed." Mike grinned. "By what? The ghost of bad decisions? I mean, do you really believe in that shit?" "I don't know. I think sometimes it has merit, like how limestone is supposed to hold residual energy," Walt responded. "More like residual farts," Mike said. They both cracked up, the kind of laughter that made your ribs hurt. It was like that with them. One dumb story led to another, and before they knew it, the nerves about what they might find in the woods melted into the background. "All right. But if we run into any wildlife this time, you're on distraction duty," Walt said, wiping a tear from his eye. "Deal, as long as you promise not to scream like a toddler in a haunted house." Walt turned the music up, and for a few minutes they just listened. The 90s sounds of Green River and Mudhoney filling the silence as the miles ticked away. Eventually the GPS chirped. Walt glanced at his phone screen. "Oh, here we go. Next left. And then we're hoofing it." Mike's stomach did a little somersault. He checked the map again. "A mile through the woods. Think you're up for it, old man?" "I was born for this," Walt said, flexing like he had any muscle to show. They pulled off onto a narrow patch of gravel, just wide enough for the Subaru. The trees pressed in close, branches arching overhead to blot out the sky. It was the kind of place where even the birds seemed to keep quiet. Walt turned off the engine. "Last chance to bail, Mike," Walt said, though his eyes held the same spark as always. Mike just grinned, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "After you, Indiana." "No time for love, Dr. Jones," Walt retorted. They stepped out, the doors thunking shut behind them, and started down the barely there path into the trees, leaving the car and the last bit of civilization behind. For a while, the woods were nothing but damp needles and the crunch of last year's leaves underfoot. Mike led, map in hand, with Walt trailing, both their breaths clouding in the morning chill. Trees pressed close, trunks wrapped in ivy, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and moss. It didn't take long to spot it, though. A house, or what was left of one, slumped between the trees, barely recognizable beneath a tangle of saplings and wild grapevine. The roof sagged inward, shingles scattered like broken teeth. Moss crawled up the siding, swallowing windows, and the front door yawned, crooked on rusted hinges. "Home sweet home," Walt muttered, voice softer now. They circled the perimeter, boots squelching in the soft loam, searching for something. Anything that screamed Cold War paranoia. Mike sifted through a drift of sodden leaves at the back porch and found a patch that didn't feel quite right. The ground was firmer, hollow sounding. He brushed aside the debris, revealing a rough outline of a rusted metal door, half buried and nearly lost to time. "Hey, Walt, over here," Mike called. His heart was pounding. Walt jogged over, eyebrows raised. Together they pried and pulled, but years of rain and rot had welded the hatch shut. Walt vanished for a moment, returning with a rock the size of a cantaloupe. "Stand back," he said. He slammed the rock down. The metallic thud echoed in the quiet, and after a few more hits, the hinges groaned and the door finally gave way, revealing a steep staircase vanishing into the pitch black. They flicked on headlamps, the beams slicing into the darkness. Mike took the first step, the concrete slick with moisture. It felt like descending into the bowels of hell. Step after step, the light barely touched the bottom. The air was colder, the smell shifting from damp earth to something older, of rusted iron, mildew, and the faint sting of ammonia. Water dripped somewhere, and each drop magnified by the silence. Walt snapped a picture, a flash painting the stairwell in stark white for a blink. "This is absolutely wild," he whispered. At last the stairs gave way to a short, low hallway. Their lights swept over walls, with mold and paint peeling like sunburned skin. The floor squelched under their boots, and every sound they made was extremely loud. A metal door waited at the end, the paint blistered and the rust feathering the edges. Mike braced himself and pushed. It swung open with a shriek, the noise swallowed by the darkness beyond. Inside, their lights revealed what must have been a kitchen once. Now it was a ruin. A long wooden table sagged in the center, its legs swollen and splitting. Chairs leaned at warped angles, some collapsed entirely, and others still standing like sentries. On the counter, cans of food had fell apart into rust and mold, the labels smeared into nothing. A pair of ancient propane tanks listed in a corner, their sides flaking away in orange patches. The cabinets hung open, insides furred with mildew. A chipped mug sat by the sink filled with slimy water, and a tangle of utensils rusted quietly in a drawer. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint constant drip of water coming from somewhere deeper inside. 3 doors led out of the kitchen. They checked the nearest one first. A bathroom, its mirror blooming with black mold. The toilet was cracked, the bowl filled with stagnant water and something green, and a once white towel, now gray and flaking apart, barely hung from a rusted metal ring. The second door opened into a storeroom. Shelves sagged under the weight of ancient supplies. Jars of cloudy preserves, cans with bulging sides, and cardboard boxes that were so damp that they'd become part of the floor. There were tools, hammers red with rust, a tangled length of hose, a box of candles melted into a single waxen mess, and in the corner, almost hidden behind a pile of rotting newspapers, was another set of stairs. This one narrower, disappearing even further down. Mike's mouth went dry. "There's more," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Now they checked the last door before venturing further. It was a bedroom, if you could call it that. 4 metal bed frames lined up against the wall, their springs bowed. Mattresses had rotted to mush, and sheets eaten through by mice and mold. A child's shoe, small and cracked, sat by one bed, its toe pointing toward the wall. Walt snapped another picture, hands a little less steady now. They regrouped in the storeroom, staring down the narrow staircase. The air here was colder, and Mike thought he felt a breeze. Mike adjusted his headlamp and swallowed hard. "You ready?" Walt nodded, eyes wide, mouth set in a line. For once, neither of them cracked a joke. They started down, their footsteps echoing, swallowed by the darkness below. Mike kept his headlamp trained on the walls, watching as the concrete gave way to something rougher. Jagged stone, dirt packed hard by 1,000 anxious hands. The bunker's careful construction ended abruptly, replaced by hand-dug tunnels that twisted off in strange angles, as if someone had burrowed blindly beneath the earth. Walt's voice was muffled and uncertain. "This wasn't in the blueprint, right?" Mike shook his head. His throat was tight. "No way, this shouldn't be here." The temperature dropped as they moved onward, their breath blooming in pale clouds. The floor sloped and buckled, shifting from cracked linoleum to sticky mud. The only light came from their headlights, beams trembling over endless branching corridors, and every now and then Mike caught the glint of something metallic. An abandoned shovel, a rusted tin, a boot with the toe gnawed away by rot. They passed rooms that barely deserved the name. One was filled with moldering crates, their stenciled letters lost to the mildew. Another had a mattress sunken into the earthen floor, its stuffing spilling out like pale fungal growths. There were scratches on the walls, sometimes words, sometimes just frantic marks made by desperate hands. Water dripped steadily from above, running down the walls in thin, greasy streams. The smell was much worse down here, sour and chemical-like. Mike's head began to ache, and the tunnels closed in, the air growing thin and sharp. They turned a corner and froze. In the distance, just beyond the reach of their lights, something moved. For a split second, Mike saw something. A shape. It was humanoid, its outline shimmering faintly, as if it were glowing from within. A sickly blue-white that barely illuminated the jagged wall behind it. It peered around the corner, head cocked, eyes catching like a pair of distant stars. Mike's blood ran cold. He fumbled for his camera, but by the time he raised it, the thing had vanished into the warren of tunnels. Walt's voice was thin and shaking. "Did you see that, Mike?" "What the hell was that?" A sudden metallic crash echoed from behind them. They spun around, but there was nothing there. In that instant, the ground seemed to tilt beneath them, the tunnels shifting, multiplying, every passage now identical, every shadow even deeper. "Mike?" Walt's voice was closer now and urgent. "Don't lose me, man. Stay close." But the dark pressed in, thick as velvet, swallowing Walt's words. Mike turned, and Walt was gone. Just gone, as if the tunnels themselves had yawned open and swallowed him whole. Panic clawed at Mike's throat. He called out, "Walt? Walt?" But his voice bounced back, mocking him. He spun in circles, the lamp beam cutting over the walls. Dirt, rock, handprints, and more tunnels. It was impossible to tell which way they'd come from. Mike pressed forward, every step a guess. The tunnels seemed to breathe, the air growing damper and heavier, but still every once in a while a slight cool breeze. Roots snaked down from the ceiling, pushing his shoulders, and the floor was slick with mud and something that looked disturbingly like old blood. He passed a room with shelves lined in jars, pickled things, clouded with time, shapes that must have been animal or perhaps even human. There was a child's drawing, scrawled in charcoal, showing a stick figure with a glowing head. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Mike's headlamp flickered, the battery warning light blinking red. He tried not to panic, but the darkness pressing closer in, alive with faint shuffling sounds just beyond the edge of his vision. He walked down the hallway he was in, rounded a corner, and froze. There, crouched at the end of the tunnel, was the creature. It hunched low, arms were long, its face a blur of pale, pulsating light. The thing tilted its head, as if recognizing him. It smiled, a tiny mouth filled with teeth like broken glass. Mike stumbled backwards, the tunnel suddenly spinning again, and the walls squeezing in. He caught a whiff of burned ozone, the air around the creature shimmering with unnatural heat. He turned and ran deeper into the maze, Walt's name echoing uselessly behind him. The sound of wet scraping footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, never rushing, as if the thing knew he had nowhere left to go. Mike was alone, deeper underground than he'd ever been, the darkness alive and waiting for him. And behind him, the thing in the tunnels was coming closer. Mike suddenly pressed his back against the cold, damp wall, heart rattling against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took a few shallow breaths, trying to get control of himself. The air down here was hard to breathe. He called out again, his voice trembling. "Walt? Walt?" Nothing but his own echo bouncing along the tunnel. He tried to listen for Walt's footsteps, but all he heard was the irregular drip, drip, drip of water, and the distant unnatural scrape of something dragging along stone. Mike forced himself forward, boots squelching in the black mud. He passed a broken wooden door hanging by a single hinge. Peering inside, his headlamp flickered over the room's contents. A pile of rotted, moth-eaten blankets, a child's tricycle with one wheel missing, and a plastic doll slumped against the far wall. The doll's face was half melted, and someone or something had scratched out the eyes, leaving ragged little holes that seemed to watch Mike as he crept on by. He moved on, though, keeping his left hand grazing the wall to keep his bearings. The tunnel forked, one path veering sharply to the right, and the other sloping down even farther. He chose downward, drawn in by some mix of dread and grim curiosity. The next room was bigger, maybe once a common area. There was a table in the center, covered in a decade's worth of dust and mold. Papers were scattered across it, yellowed with time and fragile as onion skin. Mike brushed off one and squinted. A handwritten inventory, the ink blurred by moisture. Canned baked beans, dried milk, iodine tablets, ammunition. Each item was crossed out in a frantic hand. On the floor beside the table was a battered suitcase. Mike knelt and popped the rusted latches, and inside were a few rotting shirts, a Bible swollen with moisture, and a handful of Polaroids. He held up one to his headlamp. It showed a family, a mother, a father, 2 kids, standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to the one above. But their faces were all blurred, as if the photo had been overexposed, or the faces scratched away on purpose. A sudden noise made Mike drop the photo. something skittering in the darkness behind him. A rat, probably, but his nerves were so frayed at this point. He pressed on. The tunnel walls here were rougher, and the wooden supports were splintered. He passed another side room, its door warped and swollen, and inside shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of jars filled with cloudy yellow fluid. Floating in each jar was something unidentifiable, twisted shapes, bones, clumps of hair. One jar had a label, specimen number 12, recovered in 1965. Mike felt bile rise in his throat and quickly left the room, wiping his hands on his jeans as if he could scrub the memory away. He tried to focus. "Think, Mike," he muttered. "Walt's smart. He'll be looking for you too. Just keep moving." As he rounded another corner, his headlamp glinted off something metallic. A wall of old lockers dented and streaked with brown rust. Mike pried one open. Inside hung a tattered coat, its pockets heavy with dust. At the bottom, a cracked leather wallet. He flipped it open, an ID card for Dr. Raymond Keller. The photo showed a grim-faced man in thick glasses. On the back, a note. "If found, please help my family." Mike shivered and slipped the wallet into his bag. Maybe it would mean something to someone someday. That is, if he ever got out. The oppressive dread was building, settling in Mike's bones. He could feel it. Just the way the tunnels pressed in tighter and tighter, and the way every sound seemed to echo. The way the air grew colder with each step. His headlamp was dimming, the warning light now a constant angry red. He fumbled with his backup flashlight and clicked it on. The beam was weak, but it was steady. He stumbled into the next room and nearly gagged. It was filled with beds. Cots, really, lined up in neat rows, but the mattresses were gone, replaced by piles of what looked like clothing, bundled and heaped in masses. As Mike stepped closer, he saw that it just wasn't clothing. There were bones tangled in the fabric, small and delicate ones, like those of a child or a dog. He backed away, hand shaking, and nearly tripped over a metal basin. Dried blood flaked from its rim. The panic rose, white-hot and overwhelming. He forced himself to keep moving, driven by the faint hope that Walt was somewhere ahead, maybe just around the next bend. Mike passed yet another tunnel, narrower than the rest. The walls here were covered in more of those desperate scratch marks, some spelling out the words, "No way out." "It waits. Turn back." His flashlight caught on a piece of jewelry, a tarnished locket hanging from a rusty square nail. He opened it, hands trembling. Inside was a tiny photo. A woman's face, her eyes wide with terror. And then he thought he heard something. A whisper, maybe, or just the wind moving through the maze. But Mike's breath grew shallow. He felt watched, exposed, like something was just out of sight, waiting for him to make a wrong move. He entered another chamber that was larger than the rest. Here the walls were covered in drawings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some were simple stick figures, other more elaborate, showing scenes of people hiding, people running, people with circles for heads, filled with a pale, sickly yellow crayon. One massive drawing showed a towering figure with arms outstretched, glowing faintly, while tiny humanoid shapes cowered at its feet. A sudden coldness swept through the room, and Mike's flashlight flickered. He spun around. In the tunnel beyond, he saw the glow again. Blue-white, pulsing bright in the darkness. The creature was there, watching him, head tilted. Its tiny mouth smiled. It stepped forward, silent despite its large size. Mike stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of debris. He scrambled to his feet, breathing hard, chest tight with terror. He turned and ran, the tunnels spinning, the sense of being pursued now was certainty. He didn't know if he'd ever find Walt again. He didn't know if he'd ever find a way out. But he knew the thing in the tunnels was behind him, and it was getting closer. Mike staggered through the next tunnel, his lungs burning and his legs turning to lead, the walls still closing in, the dirt and stone pressing at his shoulders, and the only sound the frantic beating of his own heart and the echo of something monstrous behind him. His mind screamed for Walt, but all he could force from his mouth was a hoarse, desperate, "Please, not here, not like this." He rounded a sharp bend and nearly collapsed in relief. In the narrow beam of his flickering light, he caught the glint of metal. An old shovel, handle snapped in half, and it was buried in a pile of loose earth and crumbling bricks. The air was colder and fresher. Instinct took over. Mike dropped to his knees, clawing at the rubble, his hands numb with fear and exhaustion, and beneath the debris, his fingers found the edge of something solid. Cement. It was cold and smooth. He shoved aside the loose bricks and dirt, uncovering a tight spiral of stairs, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It looked ancient, probably a forgotten escape route. He didn't care, though. Mike tumbled onto the first step, scrambling upward in total darkness on hands and knees, with his teeth gritted and every muscle inside of him screaming. A sudden screech echoed from below. It was unearthly, shrill and furious. The glow lit the tunnel behind him. It was a blinding, unnatural blue-white. The creature was coming faster than before, its limbs scraping against the tunnel walls. Mike's panic broke into animal terror. He grabbed a broken chunk of concrete, heavy and jagged, nearly too big to lift. He heaved himself up the steps, the creature surging after him, clawed hands snatching at his ankles. Mike turned back. His vision was swimming, and with every ounce of strength left, he hurled the stone down the narrow stairs. There was a sickening wet crunch. The stone collided square with the creature's head, caving in the glowing skull. The light flickered, spasmed, then vanished into a choking burst of darkness, and the stench of burning ozone. Mike scrambled higher, not looking back and not daring to breathe. He emerged into a small, root-choked shaft, dirt and stone giving way to the shock of open air. Night had fallen. He gasped, filling his lungs with cool pine-scented wind. Above him, stars glimmered through a tangle of branches. Mike hauled himself out of the hole and collapsed on his hands and knees, retching and sobbing. His headlamp was dead, his body was bruised. Clothes were torn and slick with mud and blood. He staggered to his feet, dizzy and bone-tired, and he turned in a slow circle trying to get his bearings. The woods were silent except for the rustle of leaves and the distant thrum of insects. It took a moment for him to realize that he was nowhere near where he and Walt had entered. The bunker's exit had spat him out nearly a mile from the abandoned house, the Subaru, the world that he'd left behind. In the hush of the woods, a sound drifted on the night breeze, a keening wail far off echoing throughout the trees. It was thin and high, almost human, and for a moment, Mike's heart leapt. "Walt?" he whispered. But the cry twisted and warped and became something else, something not meant to be heard by living ears. It faded into the blackness, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the trembling beat of Mike's heart. He stared back at the darkness below, the cold earth open like a wound. He didn't know if Walt was alive, or if something else had made that sound. He didn't know if the creature was truly dead, or if there were others watching from the tunnels, waiting for another lost soul to wander too deep. With shaking hands, Mike turned away. He limped through the trees, every shadow a threat, every sound a warning. His only thought was to reach the road, to find help, to never look back. The forest swallowed him whole, and behind him, the bunker slept, its secrets buried for now beneath root and stone, and the memory of something that should never have been found. If you guys like this one, my first book called S79, The Horror in the Swamp, is very close to this story. I wrote this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below if you wouldn't mind. Thanks. See you tomorrow.